Game over, man. Game over.
You're gonna need a bigger boat.
Why so serious?
I am Iron Man. This is a tasty burger.
Welcome to the In Session Film Podcast.
Welcome to this podcast review for August 25th, 2023. I am JD Duran, and once again, my lovely co-host Brendan cannot be here. He's very busy with wedding preparations and whatnot, so I have scoured the internet, and really there was only one guy I needed to get on for this conversation, the quintessential guest, as we get into Ira Sachs passages. It is the one and only Josh Parham from Next Best Picture. Josh, welcome back to the show, my friend.
Hello. Thank you so much for having me back, and especially to talk about this movie.
Of course, absolutely. As I noted, you were the one and only guest that I wanted for this. If anyone follows Josh on social media, if you don't, you definitely should. But if you do, you already know how he feels about this movie. The man has seen it. How many times have you seen this? At least a dozen times, it feels like.
It's been 3 times so far.
3 times, yeah.
Yes.
Your thoughts have been very enthusiastic. And of course, I had to get you on as we talk about Ira Sachs's new film. I guess before we get into it, though, you know, they had dropped that trailer some months ago. There was a little bit of buzz. Coming into this film, did you have any sort of lead up? Were you highly anticipating this, or, as we'll get into, just something that you ended up liking a lot?
Well, I mean, even before anything dropped in terms of the footage, just the announcement of new Ira Sachs, Franz Rogowski, Ben Whishaw, I'm sold right then and there.
For sure. Yeah, that's all you need to hear.
Yeah, so that was really it. And obviously, when the Sundance premiere was coming up, I was very excited, looking at every single review I could just to see what the word on it was going to be. Mm-hmm. And yeah, I knew it was going to be my number one most anticipated film of the year. And,
okay. Oh, wow.
Yeah. So, look, it's a movie that is genetically engineered for me to love. I understand for sure. But it also has everything that I love about cinema in it. Just great characters, just wonderful performances. And yeah, it's a very, very special movie to me.
Wow, that's really exciting to hear. I did not know that this was your most anticipated film of the year. So that makes this all the more exciting. I had seen your reaction to it, obviously, and I knew you had seen it quite a few times already. Did you see this actually at Sundance, or was it something you caught up with recently?
I did not see that at Sundance.
Okay.
I eventually saw it for the first time at one of my local film festivals. There's 2 that happen in Chicago. There's a one that happens in the fall and one in May. And that was the first time that I had seen it, was at that festival.
Gotcha. All right. Yeah, I recently just caught up with it myself. I had seen the marketing for it. There was a lot of buzz coming out of Sundance, but we didn't get it here in Miami until just a few days ago. And
I'm surprised you got it at all, honestly.
Yeah, and I jumped at the chance because these small movies like this, you don't know how long they're going to stay. What was it, just last week? I feel like we got Theater Camp and Dreamin' Wild. They were here for a week and then they left, and they're no longer available. So you just never know. So I certainly wanted to get my hands on this because I do like Ira Sachs and this cast. I will certainly get into that. So I guess let's just go ahead and jump into it. So as we noted, this is directed by Ira Sachs. It stars Franz Rogowski, Ben Whishaw, and Adèle Exarchopoulos. If you're not familiar with the film, it is about a gay couple's marriage that is thrown into crisis when one of them impulsively begins a passionate affair with a young woman. We've certainly let the cat out of the bag. I think we listeners watching this, listening to this, kind of have an idea of where this is going to go, but let's go ahead and get into it. Josh, what did you think of Passages?
It's one of the best movies of the year. Absolutely. And, I've followed a bit of Ira Sachs, obviously, throughout the years, and he really is a filmmaker that loves character. And it's really what I also respond to, is just character studies. And everybody is just sort of messy and complicated, but in a way that just feels so realistic and grounded. And I'm just so attracted just to that type of storytelling. And when you put these actors in these roles too, that I'm huge fans of, it just is a recipe for me to just really connect with the themes that it's exploring and how messy relationships are and how self-destructive these individuals are. And I just love it. I do. I love every frame of this film. It just speaks to everything I love about cinema, and it's just brilliant.
Yeah. So I tried to hold off as much as possible because I wanted to build this up a little bit for my opening thoughts on this film, because I have also been looking forward to this film all year long. It wasn't quite my most anticipated like Josh's, but yes, I have been looking forward to this film for quite a while. Ira Sachs is someone I've always admired. Love is Strange was one of my favorites of, what was that, 2014?
Yeah, 2014.
But perhaps more than that, even, it's our threesome here. Franz Rogowski is simply one of the best actors on the planet today. He makes the extreme nuances of performance seem effortless. Ben Whishaw, an actor I deeply adore as well. He has this gentle quality that's so infectious in his performances. And then there's Adèle Exarchopoulos. And oh my God, Josh, have I been looking forward to seeing her again in a prominent way. Say what you will about blue is the warmest color, but she gave one of the best leading actress performances of 2013 in that film. And not only that, I'd go as far as to say she gave one of the best actress performances of the 2010s, of that entire decade. That's how much I loved her in that movie. However, she hasn't done much that's been as prevalent since 2013. I did see her small role in The White Crow and Racer and the Jailbird, but neither of those films were notable in any way. She's done some French films in recent years, and from what I hear, she's really incredible in them, but they've been hard to find here in the States, and generally they haven't been touted as much. But Ira Sachs is a name we know and love, and while this film isn't mainstream per se, it's at least accessible, and that just hasn't been the case with much of Adele's work in recent years. So I think it's fair to say that this is her most noteworthy role since Blue in 2013. And man, did I love her performance here. Her character of Agatha is perhaps underwritten compared to the other two, but she's maybe my MVP for reasons we'll get into. She, at the very least, has two of my favorite moments in this film. I loved her, but that is to say, this is a movie which features two of my favorite actors, and Exarchopoulos and Rogowski, and seeing them on screen was such an incredible treat. Their scenes early on are so sensually magnetic. They're tantalizing and provocative. And Whishaw, who, again, I admire a lot, is mesmerizing in this film as well. This trio, just fantastic. Ira Sachs storytelling is pristine. The film was everything I hoped it would be. I'm with you. I loved it.
Yeah, and it's really in those performances that kind of make the movie. I mean, there's a lot of elements that are really well done, but it does sort of live and die on the strength of those actors. And I think that without the believable chemistry between them, both in like the good and the bad, you know, how they have to weather the tension, you still have to believe that they would enter into these conversations in a believable way. And I just think all of them deliver such beautiful work. And Rogowski in the center of this, yeah, he's an actor I've been kind of obsessed with for the last couple of years.
Yeah, same.
Really a fascinating actor. And it's a tricky character to play because he's pretty loathsome. Like, there's no doubt about it. He's a pretty terrible, selfish human being. Yeah. And it's hard to play that in a register that you still find some level of empathy with. And he finds it. He manages to still convey what makes him so attractive to all these other people, but you also recognize how damaging he is too, and how tragic that he almost seems to not really understand how much he really hurts other people. And to make those decisions as an actor but still keep your character fascinating and engaging is very difficult, but he does an incredible job at it.
Very well said. Rogowski's Tomas character here, man, he may be the single most compelling and repulsive character we'll see all year. He's clearly a raging narcissist who isn't afraid to not only pander to his own desires, but brazenly manipulate whatever he has to in order to achieve them. And sometimes it's something less controversial, such as him berating his cast and crew in the opening scene of the film, because he is this German filmmaker living in Paris. And, you know, sometimes filmmakers are demanding and precise in what they want in their art. So maybe that's a little bit more understandable. But when it comes to his romantic life, it becomes vivid early on that he's willing to ride the wave wherever that takes him, which makes him extremely volatile and unpredictable. There's a scene when he comes home to Martin, his husband, after spending the night with Exarchopoulos' Agatha character. And when he tells Martin what had happened, Martin almost seems unfazed. Like, this isn't the first time this has happened, something that he kind of alludes to when he leaves the apartment. So it does seem as if both of them are very aware of this kind of behavior in Tomas, and yet there doesn't seem to be any remorse or understanding of the fallout of his choices. I mean, even as they're breaking up in those early scenes, Tomas treats Martin as if he's someone that he can go back to at any time, even when his affair with Agatha is in full swing. You know, you get to that scene with Tomas and Agatha. They're at some sort of restaurant with another family, and he sees Martin come in with a few others and immediately is engulfed with jealousy and envy. He can't concentrate. All he wants is to go back to Martin. So, of course, his next move, because he feels entitled to Martin in a way, he goes back to the apartment and begins to manipulate his way back into Martin's life, which somehow works for a time, but eventually his narcissistic powers runs dry. And I don't want to get into too many spoilers here, so I'll say vaguely, he starts to become a victim of his own volatility, and the fallout of what we see at the end, it's heartbreaking, but also captivating to see how those scenes play out. And so much of that is because of course, his scene partners, but Rogowski's performance and how he works that duality with Tomas, that yes, he's repulsive, he's awful, but he's also weirdly alluring all at the same time. I don't know how he rides that line, but he makes it work. It's magic.
Yeah, you have to believe that these people find something, as you said, alluring about Tomas in order for the situation to have any kind of credibility. And
yes,
it's almost like for him, it's almost like he's got too much love to give. You know, it's like that's how he rationalizes it.
Yeah.
And I think especially for Martin, it's like this is the bedrock relationship that he can always go back to. You know, it's like no matter how much he acts out, no matter how much he gets so consumed with other things, he has a home waiting back for him. And yeah, he kind of takes advantage of that a little bit too often. And I think Martin is willing to put up with that for a certain point, but this seems like the breaking point right now in their relationship, that this is like the step too far. And you know, it's also then fascinating to think about, as you said, all the other times this has happened before and the conversations that must have happened in those situations and how this one is now suddenly different. It's a fascinating dynamic that is both played out on screen and what you have to imagine what happened before too.
Absolutely, because as we noted earlier, the film very much suggests that this isn't the first time this has happened for Tomas. And it's interesting to think about what this film is trying to suggest in terms of its ideas and, what it's trying to say about the decisions these characters make, especially with Tomas and, what he really wants, like what's motivating those desires. Because as I noted in my opening thoughts, it just seems as if he rides this wave wherever and wants to take him. But as he starts to indulge in these relationships, the thing that I find interesting, and you were certainly just alluding to it there as well, what Tomas really wants more than anything is the thing he can't have. And dramatically, that does lead to some invigorating scenes in the film, even if it's somewhat infuriating emotionally speaking. It almost doesn't make sense, but that's why, thematically speaking, and I don't know if this was ever on Sachs's mind at all, but it does evoke some really interesting questions about the appeal of Tomas despite his narcissism. I mean, as we mentioned earlier, this isn't his first rodeo having this affair. So why would Martin be open to him returning, especially after a significant piece of news that Martin receives from Tomas as it relates to Agatha? You would think, especially given Martin's tender qualities, that he would be revolted by Thomas's attempts to seduce him again, but that's not what happens. Like, he gives in to Tomas once again. Is it because of Tomas's charm? Is it a physical thing for Martin? I don't know, but I think the film, it's interesting what the film is examining here as it relates to why people keep exposing themselves to the emotional volatility that comes with the Tomases of the world. You know what I mean?
Yeah, and I think it really comes down to the feeling like this relationship between Tomas and Martin has gone through so many different kind of trials and tribulations, and it does seem like, as we said, we're trying not to give too many spoilers, but I do think that big thing that happens is probably what is the fork in the road for the two of them. It feels
Which
like
makes sense. Absolutely.
that's the real betrayal, because it's something that Martin indicates that like he wanted to be a part of it at some point.
Yep.
And I think Tomas deciding to just do that very impulsively is like the real stab in the heart for Martin. And it's like, he tries to justify it or to rationalize it in some way. He even makes a very strong attempt to be like, okay, maybe I can still deal with this and come to some kind of resolution. But he realizes that no, this is just going to be a continual cycle of destruction that Tomas is never going to be able to stop himself.
Absolutely. And it's interesting how Tomas evokes this idea within Martin. He brings it up passively as if it's not a big deal. And to Wishaw's performance, I love it because it's so internalized. He doesn't really respond much outwardly, but his little turn away from Tomas in the moment says a lot about how he feels regarding this new piece of information that's just thrown out there as if it's not a big deal. But from Tomas's end, it's him manipulating the situation. This is a way for me to bring in Martin while also trying to have a clutch on Agatha at the same time. Like, I get the best of both worlds.
Yeah.
And you see the narcissism in full display in that moment.
Exactly. And, Ben Whishaw, I fully admit that you look at my Twitter account, it might as well be a Ben Whishaw stand account. Like, I know that. I understand. I admit my biases. But I do love his performance so much.
He's great. Really
it
great.
Is so full of vulnerability and heartache, and you completely understand like how he can be in this situation, but also trying desperately to cling on to some kind of, self-esteem and self-importance. But you also get the sense of that this relationship probably has existed for many, many years, and it's hard to throw that away. But he's also going through a very tricky journey of living on his own terms, but also wanting to save or salvage some bit of this relationship until it seems like he can't do that anymore. And there's just heartbreaking scene after scene that he captures it so beautifully. I love his performance so much in this movie.
It's really quite fantastic. And while I do want to get to Agatha here in a moment, because I love Exarchopoulos, however, I completely agree with you. Whishaw is mesmerizing in this film. And one scene that I think about, especially as it relates to this significant piece of news he gets, and it does allure him back to Tomas, even though his initial reaction to it is a little repulsed by it all. He does recoil slightly, but it does eventually tether him to Tomas in a certain way. They do reconnect through this piece of news. That then takes a little bit of a turn near the end of the film, and we get this moment between Agatha and Martin. It might be the only scene between them in the film, I think. Or at the very least, they're in a couple of other scenes together, but they're never sharing a moment until we get to this
No.
cafe sequence at the end. And how that plays out, again, won't go into spoilers, but how that plays out from Martin's perspective, it again has a reveal that from Martin's perspective, it completely recontextualizes what he thinks of Agatha and what he thinks of Tomas. And it's interesting to see Whishaw tap into those sensibility, like that empathy and that almost tender sensibility that he has throughout this film. And this struggle of should I or shouldn't I regarding Tomas, and how it kind of burns a bridge, I think is really poignant. And I love Wishaw's performance. Like his reaction there, it's subtle but beautiful.
Yeah, and it's like that's what he realizes, that this path that he's on with Tomas is not only just going to be continually hurtful to him and to other people, but it's like there's collateral damage now.
Yep.
In a way that I don't think he really fully understood up until that point. And watching him realize that is, as you said, in this very reserved, subtle way, which is always the type of acting I prefer.
Same. Totally with you.
It's just amazing to see that on his face. And then you get their kind of final confrontation after that in their kitchen. And it's just another just masterclass in performances from both of them. But I think especially Whishaw, just the way that he is able to kind of finally realize what the situation he is in and communicate that to Tomas is just another wonderful moment of acting.
I agree, because the duality of it I love, because he maintains this soft, somber, tender quality that he carried throughout a lot of the film, but there's also this stern, I'm not backing down anymore. This is me putting my foot down, drawing a line in the sand. And it makes you wonder, going back to something we said earlier, that this might not have been the first time this has happened, but there had never been collateral damage like this. I would think. It seems to be like that's the case. And now that he's experienced and seen the collateral damage up close, and like the dolefulness that comes out of that is just too much for him. And it's kind of this fascinating, uplifting, but also heartbreaking moment from Martin's perspective anyway. And Whishaw it's great. It truly is a breathtaking moment of acting.
Yeah, as I said, I'm in the bag for Whishaw. I understand I'm extremely biased when liking his performances,
but it's great.
Yeah, I think he's justified here. I think he is incredible.
I agree. I do want to talk about Agatha here because, man, I loved her character. However, I think it's fair to say she isn't a saint, though, either. She does sleep with Tomas at, the first time she meets him, and soon begins an affair with him, even though she is aware that he is married to Martin, or that he is married to Martin, rather. However, it's easy to see why she would fall for him. That dance sequence early on, as we talked about, is provocative when he's courting her in those early scenes. Tomas is charming and affectionate toward her, but his volatility also leads to some of the most heartbreaking moments of the film. The first being the scene where Agatha's parents come over and they want to meet Tomas and get to know him a little bit. But as they start asking some challenging questions, it gets contentious pretty quickly. And while Agatha's reaction to the conflict is born out of embarrassment and frustration, from an outsider's perspective, admittedly, I think it's actually kind of funny. Like that shot of her at the table with her face in her hand is kind of hysterical. Like
when he walks in initially, in that ridiculous getup, it's like, hi to the in-laws. It's like right then and there, we're in for a treat.
We're in for a treat. And of course, she is angry, as she should be in that moment. But yes, from a storytelling directional standpoint, I do love how Ira Sachs sets that up. It is really quite funny, and I can't wait for this to come out digitally, because I want to be able to get that screen grab of her sitting at the table just utterly embarrassed, like trying to cover her face. It's really great. But then we get to later on in the film, and what I think is the most vivid visual of the film, where they're at Martin and Tomas's cottage in the French countryside, and she can hear Martin and Tomas. I'll just throw it out there. She hears them having sex in the next room, and we see her simply laying on the bed alone, utterly despondent and heartbroken. It's arguably the best moment of direction by Sachs in this film from a framing point of view. And maybe, or again, maybe not best, because that could, there's certainly some great moments of acting here, but it might be my favorite singular moment of acting by Exarchopoulos. Again, maybe it's the subtlety of it, it's the heartbreaking nature of it, but I find it so remarkably moving. In fact, it's so affecting that even though near the end of the film, as we talked about earlier, there's something of a reveal that is unveiled when Agatha is having that conversation with Martin, but it's really not a surprise at all. That moment of despondency at the college all but gives that away. We know what she's about to do next, I think, and no one would blame her for it. So, it does come as a huge, huge surprise to Martin. He really had no idea, but from a storytelling perspective, as someone watching all of this unfold, I think so much like that choice, like that reveal is like, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I think we kind of saw that coming. Like she had made her decision in that moment when she's lying there perpendicular on that bed alone, just utterly like galaxies away from what was happening in that moment. It's heartbreaking. And I think Exarchopoulos is so good at tapping into that despondency. Again, not saying anything. It's simple but brilliant framing and wonderful performance.
And as you said, it's like that character is not completely innocent either. She does enter this relationship knowing that it is an affair. Yep. So she is a little bit indicted herself. And I think that when you especially get to that moment, it's like her kind of realizing the entire weight of her actions and
of her own choices. Yeah,
exactly. And where it's leading towards. And yeah, that moment where she's just lying on the bed and you hear them in the other room and you understand that she knows it. And she says it, that she'll just disappear, that as much as she has an attachment to Tomas, he's not going to have that same thing back to her. And there's always going to be this other thing that's going to pull him away. And even though he says, no, I'm going to stay, I'm going to support you and all of that, she knows that's not going to be true because he doesn't have the capability himself to do that.
Yeah. Well, and that's a really great point that you make. And honestly, I didn't really think about it until right now as we're talking, which is what's so fun about having these conversations because, Agatha is very aware that she isn't blameless in all of this. No doubt about it. She makes a decision as it relates to her and Tomas's relationship that has its effects. As we noted, there's collateral damage here. Yet it's interesting to think about how firm she is in this decision. And given how the final scene plays out, there's really no denying that. There's no ambiguity to it. She's very firm in this decision. But that line that she has toward Martin about disappearing, I think is really interesting now that we're having this conversation. And it's certainly evident in that moment, where she's laying on the bed she has felt like she is completely lost in that relationship in that moment. And there's no doubt about it. She really is. So she makes a decision that's not how she's going to live her life. But what does that say about Martin? Because we noted earlier, this isn't the first time Martin has experienced this. So Agatha's not willing to put up with Tomas's nonsense, but Martin has. We know that. So I guess you could say that he for at least for a while, he was willing to disappear. And I think that makes this all the more complex in terms of the decision making here. And I guess like what these characters are willing to live with as far as the desire, that volatility within Tomas, because it's like when Tomas is with Agatha, it's not as if Martin is alone feeling sorry for himself. No, he sparks up this whole relationship, this other relationship, on his own accord. And we see how that goes. And then, of course, that gets affected by Tomas. So I don't know. Does it say something about Martin that he's okay to disappear himself because he knows that Tomas is going to come back at some point? I don't know. It's an interesting thought in the middle of all this, I think.
Yeah, I think this is one thing that the movie does a really good job at, and is very smart with the way that it handles its characters, is that everybody's kind of complicit in this situation. Nobody is entirely innocent. Even Martin, who is like the closest that you could maybe think to being an innocent party, he also puts up with this. And you get the sense that, he's tired of it now, but he has been kind of enabling the situation too for a long time. And it does put into question, like, where his sensibilities are in this relationship. And, you don't judge him for that. It just makes him a fuller character, like they all are. And that's what I love it so much.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting to see how Martin is like, well, I was going to say indirectly, but I guess in a very direct way, he is enabling this, because the moment that Tomas is willing to come back and, hey, I have a piece of news that'll bring us together, like this other guy that he's seeing, he drops him at, without any hesitation whatsoever.
Yeah, no BS for that. He sees it, it's like, I'm out.
I'm out. Yeah. He's
the smartest one in the movie.
Yeah, and forgive me, I can't remember the character's name, but
I think it's Ahmad.
Ahmad, yeah. I love the line that he has there to Martin, though, where he says something like, and I'm paraphrasing, but he says something to the effect of like, okay, that's fine. I understand what's going on here, but the only result to any of this is it's not going to be good. And maybe I'll be around when we get to that.
Yeah. Which is the response that you should have. Like that's the adult response. And that's not what any of the other three have.
No, not at all. Not at all. And, Ahmad is a prophet, apparently, because he wasn't wrong.
Exactly.
But yeah, no, it is fascinating to see how all of that plays out for sure. All right. Well, do you have any final thoughts here on Passages?
Well, I have to talk about the costumes in this movie.
Okay, yeah. Let's hear it.
Contemporary costume design is not something that gets a lot of attention, unfortunately. And it's a shame, because just as much work goes into designing a movie that takes place today as it does, a period piece. Mm-hmm. And I'm in love with everything that they make Tomas wear. I mean, all the costumes are great, but I mean, Tomas in particular, just amazing. They just stand out so much. And they say actually a lot about his self-centeredness. I think the fact that all of his costumes are so flamboyant, it says a lot about his personality. And I'm in love with every single costume design in this film.
Yeah. I love the costuming as well. The cinematography here is really quite great at times as well. And some of it comes down to, because what I really appreciate about Sachs's direction, and I think this can get lost a little bit because of internet discourse and perhaps awards plays into this as well. And you can certainly speak to that more than me. But when we talk about cinematography, and I get it, I love a lush visual as much as everybody else does. You see something exquisite and you're like, oh my God, that looks amazing. But I do think that cinematography is more than just something that is like evocative and just, where you get all of these great colors and natural skies and, natural beauty. Like a lot of cinematography also just comes down to framing and editing and how we use the image to amplify the storytelling, not just to be a great image. I think that's where someone like Noah Baumbach, for me, I think is a little underrated as a filmmaker, because he's very good at taking these contemporary spaces that on their own aren't awe-inducing, but I think he uses the camera in a really great way to amplify the characters in his films. Something like Marriage Story, I think the framing of that film is just as important as the overt emotion you get in the performances. I would say the same thing about Ira Sachs. Like the way he places the camera and frames them at times is what draws out, I think, a lot of the lushness in his films. So, like, for example, you see them in that opening nightclub, and because of the color space of it all, like the images themselves will be extremely beautiful. But what I think of in terms of the cinematography of this film are, the moment of Tomas and Agatha laying in bed and like caressing their faces. That image on its own, like the coloration of it, they're not in a grand, it's not Terrence Malick, right? Like you're not using natural landscapes to enhance the beauty of the moment. It's just them laying on a bed. That's all it is. And yet it's extremely beautiful. Or the moment of Martin and Tomas embracing after this significant piece of news, and Tomas starts crying and Martin, brings him in, and they have this, like, it's the framing of that is so poignant and beautiful. I mentioned the moment of Agatha just laying on the bed. It's a simple framing device, but it speaks to that moment in such a great way. And so the cinematography here, I think, is really evocative and helping these characters, the decisions they make, the emotion that comes about. I think the cinematography does a great job of amplifying all of that just by using the camera in this really vivid way, if that makes sense. And then, you get something like the bike ride at the end. That's a little bit more than what I'm just saying, because you get the cityscape there of Paris, but that's one of the most breathtaking moments of the whole year.
Yeah.
And part of that, of course, is the storytelling where we see Tomas at his most vulnerable. We haven't seen this guy emotionally vulnerable like this throughout this whole movie. If anything, it's been the antithesis, right? Like he's living his best life. He's got the girl, he's got the guy. Like, there's never a moment where he's, not full of self-confidence until that final sequence.
And it really goes, I think, also to Ira Sachs's direction. That
yes, absolutely.
He knows how to create intimacy so well.
Yes.
Which you also see in, the very graphic sex scenes in this movie too, that has been kind of a point of controversy a little bit in the way that we talk about these depictions in film. And it's important. Like it's important to show that these are real people in real relationships, and this is an element in relationships. And like, yes, you can look at it as like, oh, it's a little bit of a titillating factor, but as kind of you will see, there's actual plot points that are kind of associated with this too. And the way that he presents these scenes, I think, is also, you would hate to say that it is daring, but I think it's just because what we get in most modern movies just doesn't want to even recognize sex, it seems. And I just think the movie has a very smart handling on that subject matter too.
That is a really great point, and I think it's very complimentary to what I'm saying in terms of how cinematography just isn't a Terrence Malick shot. Like it's how we are enhancing the story here and the characters and how they're involved. And while I was looking at it from a more tender perspective, I guess, the sex scenes are actually a really great example of that as well. And I completely agree with what you're saying there. And it is funny because, yes, there is one sex scene here that actually does enhance the plot, like does drive plot.
Yeah. There's actual thematic and narrative value to it.
Yes, absolutely. But even the scenes that don't quote unquote drive the plot, they are necessary here, because I don't know if audiences know this or not, but people have sex. Like that's how it works. Like,
that's one of the big things that defines a relationship. Yeah,
absolutely. Absolutely. It does. And what we see here in that regard is very different. Like we noted earlier, like Agatha is drawn into Tomas, not just because of his charm or his job or whatever is there initially. Like they have a physical, intimate connection and relationship. And of course that's going to draw her closer to him. So despite knowing that he's married, of course she's going to want to be with him. It makes sense. So that intimacy absolutely has to be there. And, just in general, like the idea of sex not needing to be in this films is just ridiculous and absurd.
It's a very mature perspective that this movie has, and I'm glad that we have an example like this in theaters right now, because it's very necessary, I think.
I agree. And you know what, it's also interesting too is the sex in this film isn't gratuitous by any means. You know, like when we see
Tomas, a little bit.
well, I guess it's kind of a buildup though, right? Because like those scenes early on with Tomas and Agatha aren't like, they have clothes on through a lot of those scenes. You know, it's really not until you get to the cabin sequence where it's a little bit more graphic, I guess.
Yeah, it is more graphic in that part. But I think, again, for a purpose, because you need to see
I agree.
Just sort of unlimited passion in that moment. And then when you realize like why there was so much passion there, then it gives you the context of what that scene is actually there for.
There is a massive emotional reason for it.
Yeah.
And for both parties involved, we'll say.
Yeah, exactly.
For both parties involved, you need it. So it is the moment of the film where it has to get the most graphic. I very much do agree with that for sure. So yeah, to Sachs's direction, I love the storytelling here, love the cinematography, the editing of it is really great, and wanted to emphasize that ending because, you know, with Tomas, as we noted, he's going to make you recoil at times in this film. You know, he's a little repulsive, but Rogowski does such a great job of making him alluring, not just to the characters around him, but to the audience as well. And you're just so goddamn curious where this is going to go. Like, where is this going to end? Like, this volatility almost doesn't make sense. And then when you see how it all ends, there is a little bit of a pathos there that I think is really well earned. And yeah, that final sequence I think is a stunner. I think it's really, really great. So yeah, I'm with you. This is one of the best films of the year so far that I've seen. Really good stuff. Please go and see it if it's in your area. I don't know how long it's going to be in your area, so take advantage while you can. Go see it in the theater. I was sadly by myself. It was me, myself, and I the whole time, but I was grateful to go have that theatrical experience anyway. Josh, thanks for being here, man. This was a lot of fun.
Well, thank you so much for the invitation to talk about one of my favorite movies.
Absolutely. I noted that you write for Next Best Picture. Tell me where we can find your work online and where can we find you on social media?
Yeah, you can find most of my work on Next Best Picture. You can also find a little bit over at Awards Watch. And nice. You can also follow me on Twitter and Letterboxd at JR Parham.
Yes, please go give him a follow. Really great follow, especially if you're a Ben Whishaw fan and if you're a Passages fan. I imagine that that won't stop throughout this year.
No, certainly will not.
No, but lots of other great stuff as well. Really wonderful follow, and really appreciate you being here, Josh. This was a really great time. We have or will have a full written review of this up at InSessionFilm.com as well. I'd love to know your thoughts. If you agree or disagree with anything we had to say here, please hit us up on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. You can email us InSessionFilm@gmail.com. If you're watching on YouTube, you can, of course, leave a comment below, and we would love to hear your thoughts on that. So with that said, I think that'll do it. Please go watch this movie. Thanks for watching. Thanks for listening, everybody. We will see you next time on the In Session Film Podcast. It was great to see Adèle again.
Yeah, man, I had completely forgotten about that. The Racer and the Jailbird. I forgot that movie existed.